Hello, everyone. I wanted to welcome you to this lecture on Paul's letter to the Romans. And I have entitled this lecture The Romans Debate, in part because of a bit of scholarship that is currently progressing among scholars. And there is a debate about the purpose behind Paul's writing the letter to the Romans. And so part of what this lecture is about, besides just a basic introduction to Romans, is to help you understand that there are at least two points of view on why Paul was writing Romans. Let's get into it just by talking about the letter itself. The first thing that we can keep in mind with Paul's letter to the Romans is that this is the only of the authentic letters, the 7 authentic letters, that Paul wrote, that he wrote to a church that he didn't personally start, nor really had never visited. So in that sense, he didn't know the letter, the congregation. And his personal remarks come at the beginning and the end of the letter. And so unlike in First Thessalonians or in Corinthians, and arguably in Galatians and Philippians, this letter does not exhibit what scholars call an occasional nature. In other words, Paul isn't writing to the Romans based upon something that he's heard or some questions that he's received, or in order to deal with problems that the Romans are having. He's not writing based upon an occasion that is occurring in the congregation. And so he's not just writing to the Romans to deal with a certain issue. And there is no doubt that this letter is more theological in its writing. Paul's very, philosophical, very ordered his argument. It's very rhetorical. And he really saves a lot of the personal comments about the Romans' issues for later chapters, and he doesn't really get into their business as much as he certainly does with the Corinthians and the Thessalonians. And so I think that's probably part of the issue with Romans, is that it really is theological in a certain way, in the way that it reads. And we'll talk more about that towards the end of this lecture. The other thing that we need to consider when we look at what Paul tells us in the letter itself is where and when the letter was written. The letter was written in Cenchreae, at least that's what Paul tells us, in the port city of Corinth. So you can see Corinth. Let me get the little marker thing here. Corinth is here, and it's in the sort of straits of Greece, right? You've got this kind of an isthmus here, and then you've got mainland Greece here, and very much connected by this little bit of land mass where Corinth is over here, and the port city of Cenchreae is on this side, on the Aegean side, not the Adriatic side, but on the Aegean side of the area of Greece. And so a lot of ship trafficking around the Aegean, so from Asia Minor, what's contemporary Turkey and Greece, would stop here, and they would port the materials across this little land mass. And in fact, at certain times during the Roman period, they were trying to dig a canal, but they never finished it. But they would port the materials to this side, to the Adriatic Sea, so that the ships could then simply, ancient ships liked to follow along the coast as much as they could. They didn't like the open sea. They would follow along this side of Greece and then just skirt over and then they would be, on the other side of Italy, and then maybe come up here to deposit things for Rome, or they would sail around to get to Rome. So apparently, Kentreo and Corinth as well was very much a very busy port city with a lot of crossroads in terms of people from all over the empire would have been there. And so, again, that's part of why Paul bases his ministry in Corinth for about 2 years. It was a crossroads of the empire. Now, he is writing to Kentreo, and he tells them this is his last time sort of making this circuit through Greece and Asia Minor, where most of his congregations have been founded. And he's gone, maybe 2-3 times to visit each of these communities that he's founded, and he's finishing up his last visit, and he's been collecting money for the church in Jerusalem. See, these churches in Greece and Asia Minor were relatively wealthy compared to the church in Jerusalem, which has just gone through a famine, and he wants to take the gifts from these churches that he's received from the Gentiles, and he wants to bring it to Jerusalem. And so he's finished up his ministry here. He's in the port city, and he's about to go by sea back to Jerusalem. So he's done with his work in the Aegean Basin, but he's writing from here because he thinks it's probably the easiest way to dispatch a letter to Rome. And basically, he's writing to Rome about his future plans. So we think probably Paul's writing this letter around 59 is where I would put it. So this is after his ministry is over in the Aegean Basin, and he's about to go to Jerusalem. And so the question up for debate is, why is he writing the Romans? What are the reasons he's writing the Romans? And that's the issue that scholars are debating. And I've put the debate here as 2 different columns. And basically, if I were to label these columns, I would say on one side, there is a theological purpose. So I'll write Theo here. That he's sort of writing in terms of trying to put his theology out there. And then on the other side, I think he's dealing as well with their congregational issues. Now, that's the debate. Scholars are wondering, is he writing this basically just to put his theology out there, or does he know something about the community in Romans, and he is maybe sort of on the side addressing their issues? Now, I ultimately don't think that you can decide one way or another, but for debate, it's worth looking at both sides of the point. The first thing, I think, if you look at Romans, it looks like 1533. There's an amen there. There's sort of doxology. It looks like the letter ends really with the end of chapter 15. And so if you look at Romans 1 through 15, Romans comes off as a very sort of theological letter. And so scholars on this side of the debate, they tend to think that what Paul's trying to do is 2 things. First, he wants to get support from the Romans. He tells them he's going to come visit them after he's done with Jerusalem, and he wants financial support from them to go to Spain. Well, the question is, they don't know him, right? And he needs to introduce himself to them in order to get this financial support. Now, scholars who are on this side of the debate, they look at Romans as a heavily Gentile community that he's addressing. And so Paul's writing the Gentiles, and he's basically telling them his theology. And they really place a heavy emphasis in Romans 1 through 8, where it is very much a theological writing. And so they view Romans basically as a theological tractate written to a Gentile audience in Rome. And the purpose is basically for Paul to introduce himself with the primary goal of getting financial support towards the end, right? So basically, it's an introduction letter. And they view really 1533 as the ending, and they look at all these names that we find in 16:1 through 23 as inserted from another letter. And that's the basic point. How do we view 16:1 through 23? Is it from another letter that's been inserted on the end, or is this really part of the original letter? Now, if you'll recall, it was typical for Greco-Roman literary format, for letters written in the Greco-Roman format, to end with greetings. And so it's no surprise that Paul, greetings to people in the community, right? It's no surprise that Paul then would greet 23 people in Rome by name. How does he know them all? Well, Paul was part of an international movement. I think it's fair to say that Paul was part of a movement of people who really knew each other and engaged one another, and really were involved in one another's lives and traveled a lot. We talked about Prisca and Aquila at one point in this class, who had to flee Rome because of the Claudius edict. And Paul mentions them again in chapter 16. They're mentioned in Acts as famous co-workers. And it appears that as he's greeting them here in chapter 16, that they're back in Rome, right? So they worked with him all throughout the Aegean, through Greece and Turkey, and they helped him serve churches, but they've gone back home. They've gone back to Rome. And look, Paul is writing from Cenchreae, which is in the crossroads of the empire, and he was part of what we would call something like a business class, the people who went back and forth and traded and were part of this sort of salespeople who would go back and forth and trade and travel from city to city, and he would set up shop. That was his modus of evangelism. He would set up shop in a forum somewhere, and he was he was a leather worker, right? He would sell his goods and be working there, selling his things, and while he was doing that, he would talk with people and get to know people, and you'd see the same people from town to town. They'd go from town to town selling their wares, and that's how Paul sort of built his network of people. And so 23 of these people are back in Rome, and he knows them and he greets them. Now, if you do an analysis of these 23 names in chapter 16, and I invite you to read it when you have a chance. Some of these names are Greek names, and some of these names are Jewish names. And it would appear that instead of Romans being a heavily Gentile audience, which is what the traditional interpretation believes, we can see that the audience of Rome in the congregation was both Jewish and Gentile. And in fact, Paul goes out of his way throughout the letter to address both Jews and Gentiles, again and again and again. Paul talks about both Jews and Gentiles, both Greeks and Jews, is Jews and Greeks. Now here's the theory on this side. Here's the theory. It's an historical theory. On the congregational side, the idea is that the community has been deeply impacted by the Claudius edict. Remember the Claudius edict. Emperor Claudius kicked all the Jews out of Rome around 49. That's why Prisca and Aquila had to leave their homes, right? Because of insurrections, issues having to do with the Jewish community fighting over Christ, what we think. Well, Paul seems to be addressing a conflict in the community between Jews and Gentiles. He's not direct about it. But if you look at particularly Romans 9 through 11, he seems to be dealing with a contested question of who deserves salvation, the Jews who may have even rejected Christ, or the Gentiles who have accepted Christ but are not part of the Jewish nation. And it would seem that Paul seems to be addressing this conflict in the community between Jews and Gentiles. Well, it makes sense. If, as we believe is true, the Claudius edict was effective in getting rid of all of the Jews of Rome, and if the congregation in Rome was both Jewish and Gentile, that means there was a period of probably several years in which the congregation in Rome, the Christian congregation of Rome, was just Gentiles. And the Jews had to leave. Well, it's clear from 16:1 through 23 that there are both Jews and Gentiles there at the time of Paul's writing. So by 59, when Paul's writing this letter, they've probably returned. And you know, that's probably the source of the conflict. If you have a community, if you have a church in which half the people leave for 3 or 4 years, and they're of a different ethnicity than the group that remains, the church is going to shift. It's going to take on new traditions, and it's going to do other things. And then when the ethnic group returns, the Jewish group returns afterwards, well, they're going to be wondering what happened to this tradition or that tradition that we used to have, right? One of the biggest sources of conflict in churches that I've heard is, well, we don't do that like here. We don't do that like that here, right? You know, if you move, I've heard of congregations splitting because they moved the piano from one side of the chapel to the other side of the sanctuary. And the church split over it, right? Well, you can imagine the conflict between these two groups as the Jews have returned. And so Paul's theological emphasis, and it's for him a serious issue, right? Because God promised salvation to the Jews, regardless of what they believed. In the Old Testament, that's what God promised. You are the chosen people. You are my chose Abraham to bless all the nations through the world, and Abraham's nation would bless all the nations. So for Paul, it's a real theological issue that he's working out. So what happens about the fact that many Jews have not accepted this Messiah, Jesus, as their Messiah? Will they still receive salvation? And what do we do with the Gentiles who are not part of that earlier promise, and then they've suddenly started believing in this Jewish Messiah? How do you handle them? So that's what he's trying to work out. And so Romans looks a little bit different then. If chapters 1 through 8 is his theological introduction to the people he doesn't know in the congregation, then chapters 9 through 11 is addressing all of them in terms of their issues about how the Jews and Gentiles can work together. So whereas here, the big emphasis is we're going to look at just 1 through 8, and this is Paul's gospel. Over here, the emphasis is on 9 through 11. What is Paul doing to address the theological and ethnic differences between the two groups and the two communities? So that's the Romans debate. Ultimately, I don't think you can. I think both have to be combined in an interpretation. And so I don't think it's ultimately important to decide one way or another. So if we combine the 4 basic aims of Romans, we can combine these two debates. First, I side more on the side of folks who believe that Paul did know the congregation and was addressing at least a little bit this issue between the Romans, the Jews, and the Gentiles in the congregation. And I would say, yeah, one of the basic aims of Romans is what we see in chapters 9 through 11, is to give advice about the relationship to both Jews, between Jews and Gentiles in the congregation. Another important aim is to introduce himself to the congregation in Rome, especially to those who do not know him. And then finally, to apologize for his delay in not coming to Rome, and to ask for financial support for his eventual mission to Spain, right? He also wants prayer support from the Romans in his coming trip to Jerusalem, right? He knows he's going to Jerusalem. He worries that issues might occur when he gets there, and he wants support. First, that the congregations in Jerusalem, with whom he's had a difficult relationship in the past, might accept him, and more importantly, accept the gifts, the money that he's been gathering from the churches in Asia. And then secondly, when he gets to Jerusalem, he knows he has enemies there among the Jewish authorities, and he's afraid that they'll be hostile to him, and bad things will happen. So he wants prayer support from the Romans for that. Theologically, I think it's important to talk about what Paul's up to here in Rome. In Romans, the central thesis for his work is in chapter 1, 16 through 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. What Paul is basically proclaiming is that Christ is the power of God, that Christ is the center of the gospel, and that if you believe, if you have faith, you'll be saved. That's his basic option, right? So he puts that out there. That's his thesis in 1:16 through 17, right? This is what he preaches everywhere, that God has the power to save if you simply believe in Christ. Of course, for this thesis to be true, you have to have an antithesis, and that he lays out here in 1:18 through 3:20. That sin is pervasive, that both Jews and Greeks have succumbed to sin and are trapped, right? That they can't get out of their sin apart from Christ. The law can't save them. Their Gentile beliefs can't save them. Nothing can save them. The only thing that can save them, and that he lays that out in 3:21 through 5:21, is belief that Jesus is indeed the resurrected Messiah. That's his basic idea. And so if you believe that Jesus is the resurrected Messiah, you will be saved. Now, what's very interesting is, for talking about Christ's salvation, he has 4 different metaphors. And so I want to talk briefly about these metaphors, because you'll find these not only in Romans, but in Paul's theology as well. The first is atonement. And if you look at this word, you can break it down. At one-ment. This is what puts us at one with Christ and with God, right? This is what Christ does. Christ's work on the cross and his resurrection means that we can be at one with Christ. But atonement, in the Greek language for it anyway, has more of a priestly metaphor attached to it. Atonement is what the priest does for the believer at the temple. And it has to do with sacrificial language. You offer sacrifices. In the ancient world, that's how you made God happy, was by offering sacrifices. And so Christ, in this view, is perceived as a sacrifice to God. The Christ's death is sacrificial in that sense. And so Christ is not only the sacrifice, but also the high priest, like in Hebrews, making atonement to God so that the believer can approach God in a saved manner again. Now, Paul uses some other language. He talks about receiving redemption. Well, this is from the slave trade. A slave could be redeemed from servitude through purchase. He could save up, theoretically, enough money to purchase his own freedom from his master. And the way that would work is he would go with his master to a temple, and with a redeemer. He needed to have a person who was not a slave, a freed person, a citizen, who could redeem him. And the idea is that the redeemer would put up the money for the slave and purchase the slave and then give him his freedom. And so, and oftentimes the slave would save up the money if he were in a high, powerful household. He could maybe be doing something on the side, save up some money, buy his own freedom, buy his own redemption, give that to the redeemer, give that money anyway to the redeemer who had to buy it for him, because the slave had no civil status. to be able to buy his own freedom. So Christ, as the Redeemer, then in this language, is the one who buys our freedom from the slavery of sin. So this metaphor of redemption and Redeemer comes from the slave trade. We also have the language of reconciliation. Paul uses this in Romans 5. He uses this in 2 Corinthians 5. The fact that Christ has reconciled us to God. Because of our sins, prior sins, we are viewed as enemies to God, right? This comes out of the diplomatic trade. So Christ is almost like a great ambassador or diplomat for us. And going before God and saying, can we reconcile? Can we work things out before things get too bad? And yeah, this is what Romans would do when they went to conquer a city. They would surround it. They would be standing at the gates. And then they would send diplomats to speak with the representatives of the city. And they would seek terms of reconciliation so that there didn't have to be a battle. So those who were once enemies could then be at peace, right? So Paul uses that language quite a bit. And in fact, if you look at what Paul uses most in his letters, he uses redemption and reconciliation. Atonement a little bit, but redemption and reconciliation the most. And then in certain portions, particularly in 2 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about Christ's salvation as a victory over death, a victory over sin. And this comes obviously from the language of warfare. It could also come from the language of athletic competition, right? That Christ is the victor who has overcome the enemies of God. And because Christ has won, death has no power anymore, right? Christ has succeeded in beating death, right? So there's a victory over these things. So these are 4 metaphors, and it's important to think about that because these are metaphors from the ancient world. We use it, those of us who've gone to church may use this language. We may slip into one or the other of these words without really thinking about the metaphor behind it, where it comes from. I think it's instructive to think about these things. Okay, I know this was a long lecture, and I hope it was useful to you. And I hope you get a sense for Romans. Romans is a heavy, deep letter, but a lot of people find it very, very interesting. So I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and I hope it's been useful to you.